Hey, what's up, History Peeps? Today we're going to be going over Black history from 1492 to 1783. So from Columbus's arrival all the way to the Treaty of Paris ending the American Revolution. So we're going to get started here. The first thing that you really need to know is the African empires that existed before contact. So you have the Ghana, the Mali, and the Songhai empires. They're all in Western Africa, and they get rich off of gold and salt trading, right? So basically, most of the people that are going to come over from Africa to the Americas are going to be from that region right in here. All right, cartoony picture, but you get the general idea. Okay, so our story really takes off with a guy named Prince Henry the Navigator. He's from Portugal, and he is obsessed with Ottoman technology. He's developed the caravel, and he starts going into Africa. So under his rule up until the 1640s, he's sending expeditions into Africa, and at first they're just kind of exploring, they're searching for that Northwest Passage, but then they begin the slave trade. Portugal is really going to start the slave trade as never before seen in Europe, and it's going to intensify when you get to the Americas. Obviously in 1492, arrival of Portugal, Spain shows up, and under Christopher Columbus. And it's important to note that every black person that shows up has an interesting role. Of course, some are going to come over as slaves, but many actually are going to have a lot of different roles. Some are going to be conquistadors, some are going to be navigators, some are going to be people that are kind of liaisons between the conquistadors and diplomats. So blacks are playing a very prominent role from the beginning in the conquest story. So from the beginning, blacks are playing a large role. Okay. Also with Columbus's arrival in the New World, there is the Columbian Exchange. There is encomienda, an economic system where the conquistadors of Europe are now going to, or the conquistadors, the low people in Europe are going to come over and they're going to be the top of the hierarchy. And below them are going to be the natives, and when the natives start dying off, they're going to be replaced with black labor. Moving right along here, Gaspard Young, he is going to be the leader of a resistance of a maroon colony. A lot of slaves started running away, and he started this colony near present-day Veracruz in the highlands. And in 1606 and 1609, he is going to lead a resistance against the Spanish and win. And then a couple of years later, his protege, Francisco de la Montosa, he is going to take over, and they're going to hold off the Spanish, and they're going to establish the first free black community in the United States. So that's pretty exciting that a guy that really has no military background is going to hold off the Spanish. That's not done in the New World, hardly at all. All right, moving on to the English colonies. So we looked at the Spanish colonies. The Portuguese are going to get Brazil, and Spain is essentially going to get everything else in the Americas. And now the English show up. There's been a hurricane in Spain. So a hurricane that wipes out the Spanish Armada, and England really has a chance in the New World. Long story short, the English are going to bring over indentured servants. They're black. Some sources say that the ship was actually a Dutch ship. That's not entirely correct. It was an English ship with a Dutch flag. In case anybody caught them, they could always say that they're Dutch. They bring over these indentured servants, and over time, the issue of slavery is going to intensify. In 1619, it should be noted that it's not just the arrival of blacks, but it's also the beginning of the House of Burgesses, and women start arriving in Jamestown, which really starts to change Jamestown from this basically a frat house of a colony to a more established in terms of families and in terms of economic prosperity. Okay? Basically over time, what's going to happen from the 1630s all the way to 1691 is things are going to change for blacks in the colonies. John Punch is an indentured servant who ran away with two other indentured servants. They're all going to be caught, and John Punch is essentially going to be sentenced to a lifetime of servitude. So basically a lifetime of service simply for being black. The other two, the white indentured servants, are not going to have nearly that amount of punishment. They're just going to have 4 more years added to their indentured servitude. And that's really the first documented case that we know of a person being sentenced to a lifetime of servitude simply because of their race. Other things to notice with some of these racial laws, and race kind of in parentheses there. All men are to have weapons except for blacks and also Native Americans. Mother determines the child's freedom. So it's usually your status is determined by your father, like your last name. However, in this case, they're trying to protect in case white men have relations with black women. That way they can keep slavery going. So you really have chattel slavery, slavery determined based on your skin color. And also some other laws that are on the books during the time. It is not a crime to punish your slave and kill them, but it is to marry them or to marry Native Americans. In between that and the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, there's this thing called Bacon's Rebellion. And if you remember anything about Bacon's Rebellion, it's that indentured servitude gets replaced with slave labor. Here's essentially what happens. Nathaniel Bacon doesn't feel like he's getting the protection from Governor William Berkeley, so he goes to Governor Berkeley and asks for protection from Native Americans. That protection is not given because Governor Berkeley trades with Native Americans. Nathaniel Bacon and his indentured servants say, we served you, and now you're not giving us the things that we need. We pay taxes, we want protection. That's not happening. And so they're going to burn Jamestown to the ground. So now you have a bunch of former servants who burned your very prosperous colony to the ground. What are you going to do? Well, now you bring in slaves who are going to do the work for a long time and for a lifetime and for generations. So they're easily identified by skin color, and there's no way of getting out of that unless the master wants you out of that. So this racial hierarchy that is set up, so if you're a poor white, at least you are better than a black who is enslaved. And this system, this racial system, is going to take place in 1676, 100 years before the American Revolution, and 200 years before Reconstruction in the South. And arguably today, it's a system that still hasn't been totally dismantled, unfortunately. Okay, so you have changing views of blacks with John Punch, you have Bacon's Rebellion, and now you have the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. Basically, they're governing slaves' status and behavior, things they can and can't do. 41 parts. We don't need to go through all 41 parts, but some of the nuts and bolts are, if you're a Christian, you can't be enslaved. If you're a non-Christian, you can be enslaved. If you are a black person and you strike a white person, you will be receiving 30 to 40 lashes. That's incredible, enough to kill you, in fact. And also, it's not illegal to essentially do anything to a black. But if a black retaliates, then it's illegal. So you can definitely see the double standard happening here. Also, if you are harboring a runaway slave, you can be fined up to 150 pounds of tobacco. So that's a lot of money in those days. Moving on to the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is part of this economic system called mercantilism, where the colony's job is to benefit the mother country. You export more than you import, and a country's wealth is determined by natural resources. Along this goes the system of triangular trade, trade between England or Europe to the Caribbean and the Americas and back to Africa. You have this exchange of goods, and one of those major exchange of goods would be slave labor to the Caribbean and to the other English colonies. Death is so prominent on these slave ships that the sharks are going to follow along with the boats and eat the dead carcasses of those that are thrown overboard. If you've ever seen the movie Amistad, it gives you a pretty accurate depiction of slave life on these ships. Absolutely horrendous. Portugal is going to bring over about 4 million individuals, and in the English colonies, they're going to have about 500,000 individuals brought over by the Middle Passage. All right, in the interest of time, let's kind of move things through here. The Stono Rebellion. There's an Angolan slave named Jimmy who is going to try to lead a slave rebellion, and he's trying to get from Charleston, South Carolina to Fort St. Augustine, Florida. And basically he's trying to reach the Spanish. The Spanish say, if you get here, we will promise you freedom because we really hate those English neighbors to the north. Unfortunately, they don't get very far, and there's some new laws that are created after many of them are decapitated and killed in very horrendous ways. You have slave codes governing people's behavior. You have the Security Act, which says all white men need to have weapons on Sundays, because when do these slave rebellions happen? On Sundays, the one day off of the week. Also, there's a law that says no drums because drums were used as a communication strategy. You overthrow the plantation system, you hear the drums, and then you know that on your plantation you need to take matters into your own hands, or at least wait until they come to your plantation and start the overthrow. 2 years later, this is 1739, again before the American Revolution, 1741, New York City has a growing black population, and there's some tension between blacks and whites, and it comes to fruition here whenever New York City erupts in flames. Nobody knows what's causing this. It could be a pyromaniac, nobody really knows, but the blame, and that sometimes is the most important part, the blame gets pushed onto the blacks. So sometimes, even though something might not actually be happening in reality, perception is sometimes reality. And so what you have after here is a bunch of paranoia and hysteria about how do we protect this class of people that we've enslaved? How do we keep them subservient to us? And how do we get them to produce for us while we keep them in bondage? So that hysteria is going to kind of culminate over here to colonial tensions. The founding fathers are going to use a lot of rhetoric about slavery. We are being enslaved by Great Britain. Patrick Henry says, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Well, that liberty part is pretty important because a lot of people are going to start speaking out against this and saying, wait a minute, liberty, freedom, while you still have people in bondage? I want you to really think about that. And two famous individuals that really make America think about that are Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, and John Quincy Adams' mother. She is going to say that we're going to create this American experiment. Why don't we remember the ladies by giving them the right to vote? And why don't we not hold people in bondage? All right, she's from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is going to be one of the first colonies to free slaves. On the other side, we have a black slave who is taught to read and write, and she becomes one of the best poets in America, Phyllis Wheatley. She's so good that John Hancock and some of the other founding fathers put her on trial because they don't believe that she's actually publishing these real works, that they don't believe it's her work, and she proves them wrong. And George Washington and people in Europe are just enthralled by Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. If you haven't checked out her poetry, check it out. It's really amazing and not bad for someone that, you know, couldn't read or write at a certain age, and then at about 9 years old is taught to read and write. Okay. Moving over to black patriots. Blacks have been a part of the American struggle from the beginning. Case in point, Crispus Attucks. He's part Native American, part black, and he is the first person killed for the American cause of liberty at the Boston Massacre. Prince Estabrook is also going to be attacked at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and Peter Salem is going to hold off the British advance for a while until he himself is killed. And so you have, from the beginning of this whole American experience, all the way to the American Revolution and beyond to today, blacks are playing a very prominent role. They're not just, you know, the low part of the social system. They are playing a role in a lot of different aspects of society. Okay, moving on to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson realizes the hypocrisy of that statement. Okay? He has a black servant there when he drafts the Declaration of Independence. And for that reason, in the original first draft, he has a grievance that condemns slavery. And he blames it on the King of England, and he says that he is responsible for it and it's something that needs to be taken away. Obviously, the South is going to say, we're not going to sign the Declaration of Independence with that grievance in there, and so it is removed, and that is a problem that is left for another generation. Thomas Jefferson is going to bring up time and time again for the gradual emancipation of slaves, but really to no avail in Virginia. Okay? Last point here is the American Revolution. Blacks need to choose for themselves what course to take. Do they remain loyal to their slave masters and, you know, continue their life as a slave, or do they choose to side with the British? And there's this thing called the Dunmore Proclamation. Lord Dunmore, governor of Virginia, says, blacks, if you are enslaved and you get to a British regiment, we will guarantee your freedom. And so a lot of blacks make a choice. George Washington has several slaves on both sides, some that remain loyal for varying reasons, and some that escape and, you know, try to make their life. A great example of that is Harry Washington, who flees for the British and then is going to, after the American Revolution, be like a lot of other free blacks that served under the British. He's going to be taken to Canada and then also to Sierra Leone. So that is, in a nutshell, black history. And the important thing to remember here is that blacks are playing a lot of different roles in a lot of different stories. And so just to say, oh, blacks were slaves, that's only a part of the puzzle of a more complex history. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Black History, and we will continue with part 2 shortly, going from 1783 to 1848 and seeing really the birth of America and what happens to slavery during that time. I hope you join us. It'll be a good time. I'll see you later, and may the force be with you.